Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Georgia's Hungarian Path, Continuation or Reversal After the Elections. Before we start, I would like to mention that we have translation into Georgian, and you can find it by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of this Zoom window, but the discussion will be held in English. The last months have seen an escalation of the ruling Georgian Dream's illiberal politics, notably with the adoption of the so-called agent law and the anti-queer law. Both were adopted this summer. And these laws could be and have been named Russian laws, but we could also call them Hungarian or Hungarian-Russian laws. Evidently, the Georgian Dream has become a right-wing, ultra-conservative party, an illiberal party, and has looked not only to Russia, but also to Hungary for inspiration. Critical parliamentary elections this Saturday will show whether Georgia's Hungarian trajectory can survive. The atmosphere is getting tenser. This morning, we have seen the interrogation of civil society activists and the confiscation of their digital devices. We also saw violent attacks on politicians in the last couple of days. So the campaign is really entering its final phase. And while the Georgian Dream claims to be determined to win an absolute majority, the opposition aims at forming a coalition that would return the country to a democratic and pro-European track. During this event, we would like to touch upon the following questions. To what extent and how has Georgia copied the Hungarian illiberal model? Why are the potential costs of the Hungarian model even higher in Georgia than they were and are in Hungary? Which lessons from Hungary should be drawn by Georgia's Democrats? And what are the chances for Georgia to stay on the Hungarian path after the elections? What election outcomes are plausible and what scenarios can we expect? We have three great speakers today: Natalie Sabanadze, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House and the former Georgian ambassador to the EU. She's also the author of the publication Georgia's Imitation Game, Hungary, Russia, and the Rise of the Anti-Liberal International, which we will publish today, our HBS office. Our second speaker is Peter Kriko, Executive Director of Political Capital Institute in Hungary. And the third speaker is Nino Samharadze, Policy Analyst and frequent commentator of Georgian politics at the Georgian Institute of Politics. Thank you all for joining, and I suggest one more note. This discussion is held in a webinar format, which means that you can submit your questions through the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom window. Again, feel free to submit them whenever they arise, and we will start tackling them once the three inputs have been delivered. And we have 1 hour and 15 minutes approximately for this format. So thank you, and we start with Natalie. So Orban has developed his political model in Hungary to stay in power. The Georgian Dream evidently also wants to stay in power. Could you describe Orban's model for us, and how and what aspects of it has the Georgian Dream begun to copy, and will it help them at the election booth?
Thank you, Sonia. It's really nice to be here and to discuss this question with wonderful panelists. I have to say it was a very interesting exercise to look into this and to do a bit of compare-contrast analysis, because there is quite a lot of attention on the influence of Hungary and Orban in particular on Western Balkans, for instance, notably Serbia. However, you know, Georgia's copy or Georgia's mimicking of this model has been relatively under-researched. And I think it's important to bring this forward, because there are really a lot of similarities, both in terms of power mechanics as well as ideological framing. And, you know, the questions I tried to ask was, you know, what makes Hungarian model so attractive for the government like Georgian Dreams, and what is in it for Hungary as well, because clearly there are very close relationships right now between the Georgian Dream leadership and Fidesz. We can say that Hungary is probably the only close friend Georgia now has among the European member states. So this relationship is quite interesting. And as you say, we are discussing this on the eve of elections that are taking place on Saturday. And you may wonder, well, if the opposition wins, all of this may be irrelevant. Perhaps things will change and we'll go back to the normal, return to sort of democratic and European path. But I think understanding this imitation game and understanding the mechanisms with which states, and particularly, as I call them, closet autocrats, copy each other and support each other is really quite important beyond what happens on Saturday. It's important because neither Georgia nor Hungary are really exceptions, right? This is a trend. And one of the probably objectives here of Hungary is to normalize this model, normalization and proliferation of it, to create as many like-minded regimes as possible so that way it can mount a much more effective challenge to the classical understanding of the liberal democracy and sort of give it greater legitimacy to this approach. Plus, it's also important because we see, for example, in Poland, there has been a change of government, but there is Slovakia that might be going in that direction. So it's a fluid process. Once this model is out there, it has its own attraction. There might be states popping up and states dropping out. So understanding it is also important in terms of finding approach how to respond to it. And it is a much more sophisticated model than fully fledged Lukashenko-style authoritarianism. It is modern. It maintains this facade of legitimacy. It uses modern technologies. It combines quite skillfully sort of traditional nativism, populism, nationalism, but in a sort of modernized way, using modern technologies, using information dominance. And I'm sure Peter will talk about it. He describes it as a kind of information autocracy. This is a very modern phenomena. And in that sense, it's also harder to respond to it. It is a competitive model, and when sort of democracy promotion in general, the approach was to focus on elections, to have competitive elections, to have multi-party system. However, we saw that unless you change underlying structures, this is not enough for democracy, and you may end up having these competitive elections that actually are a way of legitimizing hybrid regimes and autocratic rule. So one of the points here, and you mentioned it in your introduction, Sonia, is that the winner of all of this, in this heightened geopolitical competition that we see between Russia and the West, and the countries sort of finding their way around to position without taking maybe sides, the winner here is Russia, maybe not by intent, but certainly by effect. So if I go briefly and describe what are the main aspects of this model and what are the similarities. One is that it is gradual. It is an incremental approach, which is partly why it is difficult to confront. It's not a coup d'etat. It's not tanks rolling through the streets where you say, okay, it's black and white, it's clear. It precisely operates within this kind of a gray zone. Is it democracy? Is it abuse of power? But how? Because it's legitimate. And you do it step by step. You introduce one law, you call a reform of an institution, while in fact you actually dismantle independence of that institution. You change the leadership, you apply human resource policies. And you do all of this legally, and that's why it's so important to note that this is a legal way of, in a way, capturing state and staying in power, because you use parliamentary supermajority, and you can claim that this is legitimate, and you can also claim that you have a popular mandate to do this. The competitive nature of this is also important, as I mentioned, because that adds to legitimacy, and that certainly adds to this claim of popular mandate. However, to kind of model election laws to your advantage is one of the basic means of achieving success. You create the political playing field, which is so uneven that actually changing the government through the ballot box is extremely difficult. Because the positions are so uneven, and the ruling party controls all the resources, controls institutions, controls courts, checks and balances are not functioning anymore. In addition, in Georgia, public sector is one of the largest employers, so you have this huge pressure mechanism. And when we talk about sort of determining election results in advance, that's why we can describe these elections as it has been described in the case of Hungary as sort of structurally rigged. It's not that they will be necessarily stolen on that very day, and for sure they will be well administered, as you will probably see in the ODIHR report. But before, the structures that are there are not conducive to fair competition, and this is important to note. Ideological framing, I will mention also before going to ideology that information dominance is an important element of it, certainly. I think in Hungary, Fidesz has perhaps even greater dominance over the information space than in Georgia. In Georgia, you still have independent media, you have a space for debate, you can watch opposition candidates, even though they don't get access perhaps to the public broadcaster and to all of the government affiliated media, but they have a room of kind of making their voice heard. Where there is a much bigger dominance is in the public space, and we saw this with the posters, with banners, and linked to this. What is the nature of these posters? It is highly polarizing. It is highly negative. It plays on fears. And monopoly over polarization is one of the instruments of staying in power. And it's something that political consultants would tell you to do, because this is how you kind of bring in the issues that really for the electorate may not be that important. I don't think anybody really felt the need to protect their children from LGBTQ community, but you bring it in, you say that this is an influence of the liberal, corrosive influence of the liberal West, and you create a cause out of nowhere to rally your supporters. So it's a technique, it's a choice rather than an inevitable sort of given of the situation. And linked to this is this ideology which is very Putinist in its essence, the kind of conservative, populist, nativist, which has a very strong sovereigntist discourse. It's striking, for instance, coming out of Budapest, which is a member state of the European Union, and the whole European Union is premised on the idea of pooling sovereignty, right? And it's also equally striking from a country that wants to become a part of the European Union, to sort of dismiss conditionality, to dismiss criticism as interference in domestic affairs. And that is something that sort of appeals, and to appeal to pride, to national identity, to respect, that can resonate among certain groups of the electorate. A lot of the messaging around it, particularly around the traditional values, defense of family, the primacy of order over plurality, the will of the majority, which is much more important than individual rights. That would be the classical sort of fundamental notion within liberal democracy. These are very similar to the Russian-style conservatism, which is developing now as and Russia is using this ideology as a foreign policy instrument. That is why I say that proliferation, and the more you have this kind of ideological alignment with Russia, gives it advantage. The effect of it is Russia's victory. And I use the term anti-liberal on purpose rather than illiberal, because this is very aggressively anti-liberal. It's basically saying, well, we tried it. We tried your Western side liberalism, and it's not for us. And we are actively against it. You know, you have more and more sort of countries, and within the European Union, far right within European countries, and not only, also in North America, sort of creating this anti-liberal international, which supports each other. It is also highly intolerant, and that's linked to this, of dissent. And it's very intolerant of criticism. And a big part of it in terms of the mechanics is demonization of the critical thought and demonization of opposition, political opposition, because any opposition to the regime is translated as an opposition to the state and state interests, but also of civil society, of academia, anybody who wants to express openly their opinion and disagreement. There is shrinking space for this, and it becomes marginalized. Now in Georgia, you can still have, you know, one outlet, a Facebook page, etc., but the space is shrinking. In terms of mechanics, I mean, we have seen it, and it's very, very similar, and it's very interesting. I mean, Orban used it in 2022 campaign, used Ukraine war very effectively. So we're having the same here, the choice between war and peace, that this is the government that can preserve peace, that can preserve stability, and linked to this, economic development and prosperity. But in exchange, please leave us alone and keep us in power all the time. Don't meddle with their fundamental rights. Again, defending family, children, traditional values, the choice of using LGBTQ propaganda. I have not seen such propaganda in Georgia, but apparently it needs to be regulated by law. So this kind of issues certainly work, and they have worked not only in Georgia and Hungary, but we have seen other places as well. Conspiracies. This is also quite interesting. You know, this kind of the reference to global elites and the incarnation of it in the Hungarian context is George Soros. At least in Hungary, it has a concrete face. While in Georgia, we now all have to think, where is that global war party that is trying to drag us into war? We don't have, it doesn't have headquarters, doesn't have people, but you know, you are supposed to believe in something that is the global conspiracy taking place, the language of treason, and also, interestingly, the language of neocolonialism. And here, this is an entirely Russian instrument of gaining support, particularly in the global south, that the West is neocolonial, and talking about Brussels as a neocolonial kind of a center, and the imposition and request of conditionality is part of this neocolonial logic is very interesting and striking, especially if it is happening in countries that have actually experienced Russian colonialism. And now briefly, I want to say what are the differences, and you mentioned it. The major difference is that the costs of it for Georgia are higher than for Hungary, because Hungary is in the European Union and NATO, and there is European Court of Justice that can, you know, basically say the foreign agents law is incompatible with the EU law. We are stuck with it. Orban is also a very skillful politician who is not seeking Hungary's isolation. At least that's my impression. On the contrary, through himself, he's trying to put Hungary on the map. He's appealing to this pride, a leader of a small to medium-sized country who can go see Trump and see basically within 72 hours. This is impressive. And he's very active in the international scene. And while we have broken down our relationship with the United States, both with the administration, but more broadly, there at least he is building very strong ties with one political camp. So I think Georgia faces a serious threat of international isolation, which means isolation from the West, really, which will push us closer to the kind of alignment that is dominated by global authoritarian powers such as Russia and China. Another difference is ideological inconsistency. I mean, Fidesz has always been right-wing, and it has radicalized over time, but it has been relatively consistent, and the announcement about building a illiberal state and so on. Georgian Dream in a relatively short period of time, and that's why I think it is it's very circumstantial. It is, again, a political choice rather than a real ideological motivation. They have changed dramatically. As you know, there have been a party center-left that was a member of the European Socialists, and now we find Georgian Dream prime ministers at the meetings of CPAC, and they have gone radical right. So this kind of political migration from left to right is really striking. And finally, it's the radicalization. I think both in Hungary and in Georgia, we see an incremental radicalization of the regime. But now, these latest, particularly in this election campaign, there are real fears that maybe Georgia might be stepping out of the urbanization model and going much more in the direction of Putinization, because you have a ruling party campaigning openly on authoritarian ticket, saying that they will outlaw the opposition, that they will prosecute them, that they will be held accountable. And the attack you mentioned on a member of a political party followed exactly the interview of the leader of the ruling party that said, this is the party that I'm going to target. So this creates real risks, actually, that maybe this will be the last democratic elections in Georgia. So particularly underscoring how high stakes are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for this extremely interesting overview of the commonalities, but also the differences between the Hungarian and the Georgian-Hungarian model, and also for highlighting the particular danger of isolation from the West facing Georgia. Let's continue with Peter. I have two main questions for you, but feel free, of course, to also comment on what Natalie said, as you have a long experience with Hungarian politics, analyzing Hungarian politics. I would like to ask, first of all, what could we expect in terms of the Hungarian model or the strengthening of ties if the Georgian Dream stays in power? And secondly, what would be your advice on how to fight this model? Maybe, what went wrong in Hungary, or what is maybe developing in Hungary right now? What could Georgia's Democrats learn from Hungarian Democrats? Thank you.
Yes, so first of all, thanks a lot for having me on this conversation. I'm also happy to respond to the call of Sonia and the Heriberg Stiftung in office in Tbilisi, and also congratulations for the study for Natalie, and also for the office as well for commissioning it. I think it's a crucially important, really in-depth and really deep analysis of these interlinkages that just puts the whole phenomenon in a global context. And honestly, I feel a bit that there are not so many things remain to say after Natalie's introduction, but I will try to reflect on a few points and also respond to your questions, Sonia. So I think that this whole framework of imitation is crucially important, and because it really describes well, I think, the goals of Viktor Orban, in the sense that he really wants to be a model, an illiberal model, not only in Europe, but also in the overall world. And I mean, I don't want to get too much credit for Viktor Orban in the sense that how influential he is. And Natalie have already mentioned the danger of isolation of Georgia in the international stage. Hungary have already suffers isolation mainly within the European Union, where I think Orban plays increasingly more the model when it comes, especially in the European Council, the most important decision-making body of the European Union. He's rather a counter-indicator of success than the indicator. So what Orban says and does, it's mostly against the majority. And if Orban says something, that the majority just forms on the opposite position. But I think when it comes to soft power, Orban has definitely become extremely successful. Don't forget that Donald Trump is mentioning Viktor Orban personally every second week. And he is a leader of a country of 10 million within the European Union, within the NATO, the most boring place in the world geopolitically. And still he does that. So there has been a lot of work invested into that through think tanks, through intellectuals, through international trips, and a lot of investment into diplomacy, but diplomacy not in the classical sense. This is not what Orban does. It's not bilateral diplomacy. It's bipersonal and bi-party diplomacy. So it's a classical way of transactional foreign policy. When you go to the strongman goes to the strongman and builds ties with them. And there is a really great book that I find highly inspirational. It's The Lie That Failed, from Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. And their mere argument, and it goes back to Natalie's point on imitation, is that the Central Eastern European populism, and maybe it's due to a certain extent to Georgian populism as well, is getting strong and attractive among the youngsters because it has a main message. I don't want to imitate the West anymore. I'm fed up with getting lectures from Brussels, from Washington, from Berlin, from Paris. We want to be the ones that others imitate. And Orban is doing that with high success. So it's ideology on the one hand. We want to be sovereign. We want to have an own way of politics. And we can just remind ourselves that the term sovereign democracy is also a Russian invention. It comes from Vladislav Surkov. It's not that much mentioned anymore. The word democracy, I think, is a bit lacking from the Russian discourses these days, but it's also what Orban represents, and it had been told already, is highly inspired by Putin's regime and rhetoric, even if, and we have to be very clear about that, Hungary, I would say, is rather at the moment a soft hybrid regime with a low level of direct repression. And in that respect, there are more differences with the Putin regime that openly jails its opponents than similarities. But on the other hand, and it also goes back to another point that Natalie have mentioned, the occupation of the information space is something that is unprecedentedly developed in Hungary. Hungary has the most centralized media system in the whole European Union, where you have the state media, plus you have a so-called Central European Media Foundation with more than 500 media outlets under direct political control in a country of 10 million, parroting the same message day by day, spreading disinformation, and mostly around the narratives that has been already discussed. And I think illiberal, anti-liberal illiberal, and I think it's an absolutely justified term. So it is a good description. It's increasingly homophobic. It's increasingly openly anti-Western. It's increasingly sympathetic towards Russia, and in many sense, I think it has narratives that also originate in Russia. And I think, for example, the one that has been already mentioned, that you conflate LGBTQ issues with pedophilia. You say that whatever that is sexually atypical is dangerous for our children. I think it's pretty much, for example, Russian import that Orban exports elsewhere to other parts of the world. Europe, United States, Brazil, and other parts as well. I think coming back to and one more point here about imitation is that, of course, Orban wants to be imitated, but he puts together a set of ideas and systemic approaches that are also imitating certain amount parts from the East, from Russia, but he's not open about that, but parts from the European Union. And we shouldn't forget that European Union now is not the European Union, let's say 10 years ago. It's a less democratic model to follow, where politicians like Giorgia Meloni can remain really mainstream with a line of policy that accepts the major economic and foreign policy fundamentals of the European Union, while on the other hand, doing some illiberal games at home that remains more or less unreflected within the whole European Union. But and Orban copies some sound bites from the European Union. For example, defense of sovereignty. This has been one point in the defense of democracy package of Ursula von der Leyen. Don't let other states, including Russia, to interfere into your electoral processes. And the liberals just reverse this argument and say that, okay, I think we should rather think that the West is the one that shouldn't interfere to our political processes. And two short final points coming back to respond Sonya's question as well. I mean, first, what to expect? I think the sustainability of both the Georgian regime. Of course, you will have the elections, and I'm really not an expert of Georgian politics, so we'll be eager to hear about the possible outcome. But if it happens that Georgian Dream wins the election again, I think the fate of the Georgian and the Hungarian model as well, I think is in a lot of sense in the United States. So if Donald Trump is re-elected, then I think all the liberals who go against EU mainstream, but on the other hand have some transatlantic support, can make a much more sustainable regime. But if I think Trump loses, then I think it will lead also to a setback. And in Hungary at the moment, the Hungarian government is not as stable as it used to be. So we have a challenger of Viktor Orban, and his party is neck to neck to the governmental party. So far, Orban could invest a lot in foreign policy for simple reason, because he had a domestic politics where nothing happened practically, when he could be 100% sure that he is getting reelected. It's not the case anymore. So the more unstable, the more, the more you have to defend your position domestically, the less time you have to deal with systemic challenges, and the less time you have to export your ideas. And that would also come to my suggestion, and the suggestion would be is that don't let anything don't let anything go. So I think the nature of these illiberal regimes is that the less counterforce they perceive, the further they go. So even if demonstrations becoming boring, even if you feel that they lead to nowhere, even if you feel that it's just waste of time and it does not result in any actual direct outcome, keep doing that, keep raising your voice, because it finally matters. And it's like the more counterforce an illiberal regime needs, the slower, at least, the more incremental the changes have to be. And in certain circumstances, it's already a win. And on the other hand, yeah, the other suggestion would be just stay positive about the fact that as Hungary has, I think, Western future, Georgia has a Western future as well. And there is a big chunk of the population who just resists what the government does. I will stop here. Sorry if I was a bit longer than expected.
Thank you very much, Peter, also for this important call to action and to not give in. Let's move to Nino. Peter highlighted that the Orban model plays with the idea that people are fed up with lectures from Brussels, but at the same time in Georgia, the population is overwhelmingly pro-European and actually wants the country to join the European Union. Another aspect I want to bring in is what Natalie said, that the Hungarian model is competitive. Competitive authoritarianism is the term from political science, or also a hybrid regime, but there is an element of competition, political competition. So let's touch upon the question also to whom the Hungarian model is appealing in Georgia. Does this actually work? Does it resonate with people? And what to make of this sovereignist discourse if the country actually and its people want to join the European Union? And then, of course, more broadly, we are very interested in your impressions from the regions. You wrote a really interesting paper on that for the Georgian Institute of Politics, the election campaign in the regions, young people. What do you expect from those different groups of voters for Saturday?
Yes, thank you very much for having an eye on us in general and having me for this conversation. Really, along with the important and deep analysis suggested by Mr. Banadze and Mr. Greco, and I will try to somehow put all my insights in the context as well. So as Mr. Greco mentioned, Orban in Hungary really wants to be a role model of such kind of new type of competitive authoritarianism, as you mentioned, Sonia. And I would say that GD government, Georgian Dream Ruling Party, is I think gladly taking Orban's model as a role model. So this is kind of really successful marriage, the EU country which tries to position as a different type of European Union, and the non-EU or aspiring country, Georgia, which is trying to show somehow to the Georgian population that there are two types of EUs in general, which is one like the bad EU and the good EU. And this model is kind of manifestation of how Orban also tries to put his kind of hand and influence beyond EU to show itself as having some friends beyond EU or among the future EU member even formally. So what are basically the expectations and chances for Georgia to stay on this road, which has been launched by the GD government, or escape it? For both scenarios, chances are real. For both scenarios, chances are almost equal, even I would say. And this equity has its own logical background, logical explanation. Why I'm saying this, because we see in general on the Georgian political landscape two key existential ideological flanks, kind of. One is pro-European, pro-democratic opposition, even though opposition is quite, it had been fragmented and diversified. And on another side of the river, there is GD itself with its like conservative, populist, anti-liberal, and de facto anti-EU kind of power. So at this moment for the elections, we are basically voting not only for the parties, but for the ideas, general ideas. This makes this battle for the opposition kind of tough now and also unpredictable. Two dimensions of this notion from my side. One is that opposition itself, before it was considered in Georgia being again weak and fragmented and marginalized, sometimes even demonized among the broader public in Georgia. Now they managed to consolidate over one key axis, existential axis, which is democratization and Europeanization in general, but they still remain weak. They still lack public trust, especially in the region, because usually Tbilisi, the capital city, and larger cities are more engaged with parties, more engaged with political processes, more engaged with pro-European political processes related to reforms, democratization, and etc. and etc. Another dimension of this all is the double difficult task for Georgian Dream Party itself, which makes Georgian Dream Party exceptionally motivated now to engage its supporters and even beyond its supporters. So on one hand, we are facing for the first time in our political history, the fully proportional system where people are voting for the parties, not concrete faces, as the majoritarian candidates. So now GD is lacking this luxury to have the 40-something% through the proportional system as a votes or support. And now they are having this new task on their shoulders. They have to gain overwhelming support through the votes. That's why GD is particularly intensified in terms of its pressuring mechanisms or narratives or fundamentally new style of campaigning and etc. On the other hand, due to number of unpopular legislations which GD introduced throughout these years, undemocratic, unpopular, which led to the public turbulence in Tbilisi and beyond as well, like a sort of public support, not in terms of votes, but public support is like in terms of dynamics, it is decreasing. So GD remains the most popular party in Georgia so far, according to different public opinion surveys, but still its support is not anymore 40-something. It is in the range of 30-35%, according to different public opinion polls. I am here excluding these pro-governmental public opinion surveys intentionally, which they exist as well. We have some interesting outcomes, like above 60% support for GD, but we consider those results as non-reliable at this moment. So I'm calculating based on more or less objective and reliable sources. So given this all, opposition parties had a unique task this time. Opposition parties needed to, and they still need to campaign within this existential dichotomic narratives, democracy versus autocracy, or pro-Europeanness versus something else, whatever de facto this something else is. Probably it is pro-Russianness, sometimes it is this multi-vectoral foreign policy choices and etc. So opposition parties should campaign through this frame, existential frame. On the other hand, especially in the regions where daily hardships are more painful and population in the regions are more vulnerable towards the daily challenges related to, I don't know, prices, unemployment, economy, and etc. and accessibility to different social services and etc. They needed to address also concretely to those daily hardships. This time, every single party elects the opportunity to campaign through the majoritarian candidates. So this made parties' job in the regions more difficult. Now it became more or less kind of a conversation based on key axis ideas for Georgia rather than region-based or demography-based or specific needs-based campaigning. Even though political parties try to do that, they claim that they try to do that. They try to reflect specific needs, specific fears, and specific concerns among the different rural and urban areas beyond Tbilisi. It is obvious that the gap between the society and the political parties has not decreased, at least. I cannot claim that it is increasing, but if you look at, again, public opinion surveys, you will see that regions, both as well as rural as well as city areas, urban areas, people are lacking a trust towards political parties there, even more, rather than in Tbilisi or other bigger cities. On the other hand, population in the regions are showing their concern towards the political processes in Georgia. And like, for example, more turning out, stronger and intensive turning out at the ballot box during the previous elections show that they are concerned in the political processes. They are concerned in developments about the country. So this is not necessarily nihilism, why they lack this party identity in the regions. So I think that this is kind of vacuum now, kind of existing real demand among the population in the regions, and political parties should somehow address those specific areas, vacuum areas. And I think this could be a perfect match of new power, fundamentally new power, whether it is different formed coalition government, or whether it is party by party communication throughout the regions. This is the vacuum which can be utilized successfully by this new power. And last point from my side, and I think slowly I will wrap up, talking about regions here. Now we have to remember that those elections are really unique, in not only in terms of political context, but in terms of political actors as well. We're mentioning that we should vote for the parties. We cannot go beyond this conventional rule. We have to choose parties, not just ideas or other subjects. But this time we have really important, like value-added additional actors who are kind of guarantors of consolidating the pro-European, pro-democratic new style of power, which is on one hand the president of Georgia through her Georgian Charter, which is the document which enshrines the list of the concrete reforms. Those reforms are basically not referring to specific needs, specific hardship. They are not suggesting like stratification of demographic cohort of the society. But anyway, those reforms suggested in the charter, they are creating the key frame for the political parties through which they can communicate to the regional society, different parts of the societies in mountains, in ethnic minority settlements, or in religious minority settlements, in the areas which are more tourism based, or the areas which are more other economic activities. So through this guarantor of kind of consolidation of the collective opposition parties, this trust could be also increased. I hope it increased, and it will be reflected at the ballot boxes as well, throughout the regions as well. And there is strong civil society mobilization as well. Civil society organizations in Georgia are basically one of the pioneers and leading areas who are communicating not only political elites, but constantly they are in touch, like my organization, for example, or me personally as a researcher, constantly in touch with the population in the region, with different characteristics, different specificities. So also successful cooperation of political parties and civil society organizations, which are equipped with necessary knowledge about those people, giving the fact that political parties usually lack like human resources, sometimes even financial resources, or authority and reputation to talk to those people, this cooperation could be also a kind of success to keep Georgia away from this Hungarian model, to keep democracy on the track within the regions, not only in Tbilisi, which usually is considered the central political and social turbulences in Georgia. And Sonia, I know I have the youth among my topics. I'm just double checking if I have time for a couple of sentences about them. And
couple of sentences.
Yes. Because this is really crucial, I would say even game changer cohort of the society. At this moment, we don't have any statistics or mathematics about mobilization, like as an indicator about mobilization of youth for the election specifically, but based on like logical assumptions. Youth in Georgia is the demographic cohort which is in most intensively in touch with not only European like civilization or pathos, but pragmatically with European educational system, for example, or they are studying European systems, how beneficial they could be. So Georgian youth is aware of how painful this approximation process could be, but they at the same time they are well aware of how necessary, existentially necessary, keeping touch with EU integration process itself, regardless the membership prospects, how important the process itself could be. So Georgian youth is now facing the challenge of for example, usually they have usual challenges of they are more collected in Tbilisi because educational system in Georgia is more dominated by Tbilisi, but at this time, based on different qualitative assumptions and assessments from my side, is that they are exceptionally mobilized logistically or emotionally, or they are registering in their local communities as an volunteer observers, election observers. So they could be on one hand game changers, at the same time kind of surprise for the GD party in purely mathematical terms, when GD is planning a certain percentage of what their support could be in terms of votes after the elections. Youth could be here a really important changing marker. So here I could wrap up my small introductory, hopefully part of my assessments, and I am more than glad to answer any question from our audience about those topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nino. We already have 3 very interesting questions, and maybe we'll just start with one of them about the potential reaction of the West or the EU and the US in case the Georgian dream stays in power and continues with the Hungarian model or worse. I would like to pose this question to Natalie, and also if you want to respond to some of the points that were made, feel free to do so, but also to Peter afterwards, because yeah, I mean, for a long time, I think the EU has also been criticized of being too lenient or too permissive with what has happened in Hungary. So Natalie and Peter, what are your ideas and suggestions on how the EU should position itself if the Hungarian model stays, especially in light of the frozen EU perspective of Georgia, coupled with the general pro-European orientation within the population? Natalie.
Thank you, Sonia. And it is actually a really difficult question, right? Translating analysis into policy suggestions. And in many ways, EU is in a particularly challenging position. Partly, of course, because Hungary is the EU. And that is the appeal of the Hungarian model to the Georgian public, which, as Nino has mentioned, is very pro-European, including among the Georgian Dream voters. So this is important that this is Europe. But in terms of and it also allows Georgian Dream precisely to present that, well, Europe is not only this liberal Europe. We can get into the EU, and maybe it will be a different type of the EU. And that's also what probably Orban is betting on, a kind of a shift towards more conservative, more collectivistic, more sovereigntist EU of the patriots, as the grouping within the European Parliament is called. And then, as Peter mentioned, in terms of responses, of course, the elections in the US, interestingly enough, will have a direct impact, because this will have an impact on the way liberal and anti-liberal forces face up each other, and where the US will be in this kind of confrontation. Not literally confrontation, but ideological debate. And here, I think both Hungary and perhaps with some guidance, the Georgian Dream too is betting on the victory of Trump, is betting on the victory of the right-wing parties within the EU, paradoxically, because they are enlargement skeptics, of course, right? They're not going to help Georgia get into the EU. But it is this sort of regime type alignment which is so much more comfortable, and the victory in the United States of a political power which is also much more conservative and understanding of leaders like Orban would be a big boost. There is no doubt about it, and it will limit further EU's room for maneuver. Partly the problem I mentioned that the Hungary is EU is, EU presents it has its set of criteria, it has its conditionality, but it becomes very easy to point to the credibility issue. You have Hungary, it is still a member, and yes, you take measures. Hungary is increasingly isolated, but then can you really speak in one voice? And do you really have the same legitimacy to demand something from the aspirant country that you cannot enforce at home? So that is a blow to the European legitimacy. It is also, EU is coming, has to face the kind of limits of its transformative power in this situation, particularly if you put it in the wider context of the South Caucasus, which is becoming increasingly fragmented. You have more and more actors playing a role, and the EU is just one of them, which is not necessarily the strongest and no longer the most appealing, particularly for certain governments and regimes. So before the perception that, and this is linked also to, in a way, diminishing role or strength of Russia in the region as a result of the war, but diminishing strength of and threat from Russia, the way it is perceived, has not increased EU's attractiveness. It did the opposite. Now, leaders like those in the GD think, well, Russia can be balanced by other actors, perhaps more effectively. So we'll look at Iran, and we'll look at Turkey, and we'll look at China. So there is a diversification of actors and a relative leveling of their powers. So the key here, the biggest constraint to this, and which is also an asset for the European Union, is of course what Nina was describing, which is the societal resilience. And Georgia has really proven to be democratically on the level of the population quite resilient. I mean, the kind of reactions we saw against the foreign agents law has not been anywhere else, really, this kind of sustained protest, because people understood that this was not only about NGOs, even though that is also important, that it is a bigger issue at risk. The way these protests were formed, that were not led by political parties, but were led by civil society, that was led by young people, the grassroots mobilization. And what we see now in advance of these elections, this kind of a massive registration of observers, the mobilization of the youth, these are elements that are actually more effective constraint on the power grab than anything else from outside. So I think the EU has to understand this and really support these forces in Georgia, because real democratization is not only about elections and parties, but it is about actually democratic resilience from below. And I also think that we have to start thinking about structures. You know, we have to, and I don't know, this cannot be probably imposed from outside, but can be supported. You know, how do we make Georgian state resistant of capture also in the future? And move towards the proportional system is one, but it's not gonna address all the issues. Maybe we need another camera in the parliament. We need extra checks that will limit the possibility for any political power that comes, no matter how big the mandate is, that will not be tempted to do the same thing, because that has been the story of Georgia all the time. I mean, Georgian Dream is not doing anything exceptional. So, I mean, there are real limits in terms of the impact from what the conditionality, what the EU promise can do, but at the same time, this has mobilized people. And, you know, you can see the limits, but you can also still see the power of attraction. And this needs to be leveraged in my view.
Thank you very much, Natalie, also for this interesting point on checks and balances and what new checks and balances could be introduced, and if there is a chance. In fact, we are having the same conversation in Germany right now, which again leads us back to the question of increasing illiberalism within the EU and how it affects the EU's credibility, which is, yeah, of course, is a very sad development. But let's move to Peter and hear from you how the EU could support Georgia's Democrats if the Georgian Dream stays in power, and what we could learn from Hungary on how maybe not to do it.
Yeah, thank you. So I will start by saying, and I should have told it in the previous round, that the big difference between, and it's self-evident to a certain extent, but the big difference between Hungary and Georgia is that Hungary is an EU and NATO member state, while Georgia is not. So the positive aspects of that are that Hungary has been characterized by brilliant Hungarian political scientists as an externally constrained hybrid regime, which is like the EU set some constitutional or, I mean, legal boundaries to illiberalization or anti-liberal moves. And that, to be more specific about that, there has been one foreign agent law that was passed in 2016-17 that was then abolished by the European Court of Justice. There was a so-called Stop Soros agent law, which, by the way, came from Macedonia. So it's like the imitation game is a circular one. It's not necessarily unidirectional, but it was abolished. It was, I think, passed in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, but it was also abolished a few years later. Right now, there is a so-called Sovereignty Protection Office that just does not deal anything with also, of course, Russia and China, only with Western influence. But I'm pretty sure that it will be abolished by the European Court of Justice a few years later. So at least, and these are hard external constraints for Hungary. You can disobey the decision of the European Court of Justice, but it has serious consequences, as we could see it. And so this is the positive side of being the member of the European Union, that some of the illiberal measures are slowed down. I just received this, I think, horrible news that was just mentioned recently, that two Georgian activists, analysts have just been, if I understand it well, their homes were raided. One of them, Eto Buziashvili, is a friend of mine who we also visited to Budapest, so I feel personally touched about that. And it's a horrible move. It's really rare, almost non-existent in Hungary. So this kind of hard authoritarian step is more rare in Hungary. The soft authoritarian step, of course, is more frequent. But to reverse this and tell something positive to Georgia, in the Central European experiences has been that anti-European or Eurosceptic movements before the EU accession were doomed to fail. Because it's a different thing to play Eurosceptic when you're already in the club. If you're out of the club and you are presented as the main obstacle of Western integration in a country that, of course, divided in the question of West and East. All the countries are divided, even the most Western ones. But you have a substantial big chunk of the population that desperately wants to belong to the West, then I think sooner or later becomes an obstacle of political growth. And there has been, I mean, let's think about Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia, for example, who I think mostly lost his political appeal because he was regarded to be an obstacle of EU integration, and it happened to other forces in Romania, in Bulgaria as well. So I think that in the pre-accession period, I think being an obstacle of accession, I think is a serious thing. And the most important thing, you have just to take a look at the economic growth that all the countries that joined the European Union could produce as a result of their EU membership right after the accession. You lose all these funds if you don't, let's say, respect the pre-accession rules of the European Union. And I think it could be a powerful message. Maybe we live in different times now than we lived, let's say, in 20 years ago. But I think this general framework of if you are outside of the European Union, then Euroscepticism is just more dangerous. I think it remains an important point for contemporary Georgia as well.
Thank you very much. We are already running out of time, and there are a lot of interesting questions. So I would suggest that I've collected some of them, and I would pose 2 questions to Nino and then 2 to Natalie, 2 to 3. So maybe to start with Nino, there are some questions about the manipulations in the pre-electoral period, use of administrative resources, how free, unfree are the elections, and then secondly, the charter of President Zurabishvili, how likely is it that it will actually be used, also in light of the fact that no prime minister candidate has been announced. There seems to have been some disagreement on that. Do you think the parties will manage to get together after the election?
Yes, thank you for both questions. I really wanted somehow to cover them. It's to some extent within my speech, but since we have questions about them, I will try to provide some insights from my side about the first question. First, about manipulation and to what extent free and transparent elections are in the hands of GD, to say so. We have to note here that this time we have technical dimension first, sorry. Technical dimension dictates us that technical mechanisms of frauding the votes is somehow limited for the GD-related structures, either the GD-related observers or GD-related informal kind of coordinators. This is how we refer them in Georgia. I'm not sure about other countries, but parties usually are having coordinators, informal community observers in terms of attracting and mobilizing a certain type of votes in a certain districts and communities. So this type of control technically should be limited. So this is the first time basically when we are overwhelmingly delivering our voting process through this digital word counting mechanism. So this is basically a test also to what extent the observation missions manage to secure the votes properly. I cannot predict really, but at least logically this dimension should be limited. dimension of manipulating the votes should be limited. But there are different broader contexts of how GD can intervene in changing the outcomes of the elections. GD is starting manipulating votes before the election day itself. It has started to do so already, starting from the kind of low-level citizens who are in public sector, who are employed in public sector, like, I don't know, bus drivers or people working in the streets and parks and etc. They are on the state salary. They are easily manipulated, even without any certain aggressive attempt to manipulate them. For example, giving them vacation day during the GD rallies. So this is kind of indirect indication from the governing bodies that you have to attend the GD rally because you have vocation on that day. So this creates the atmosphere for those people that they have to vote for the GD as well. Otherwise, they are going to lose their jobs, which are controlled by local municipalities or state in general as such. Additionally, there are not the overwhelming aggressive type of like hostile type of campaigning against politicians, but there are spotted aggressions, spotted violations, which means that, for example, beating up one politician competitor, which happened last days in case of Gaharia for Georgia party member who was a victim of some attacks. So those are spotted violations, which gives signals to other competitors, other activists, other influencers on campaigning and pre-electoral processes. And last part is even broader, which is already the consolidated control over the crucially important state institutions such as Central Election Committee, over which GD somehow managed to de facto rule out the role of opposition in the decision-making process. So Central Election Committee officially remains as neutral state institution, but de facto the Central Election Committee is effectively controlled by GD when making the important decisions about votes counting or about logistical decisions, delivering the voting spots or techniques or when to count what or who should be ruled out, for example, from the observation process of the election. So those small manipulations at the end of the day, like as a cumulative impact on the election results, are really considerable and really important to take into the consideration. About manipulation, this is all what I can share to our audience at this point. And there was another question about charter and this potential of technical government as well. We have to mention this, which is the kind of, on one hand, trusted suggestion from the president Salome Zurabishvili. On the other hand, still remains as a mystical suggestion because we don't know yet how this composition of technical government works, who is going to be a prime minister, if this candidate of prime minister is coming from the political elites or from somewhere else, such as, for example, intellectual elites or business elites or etc., who should be also trusted not only among the political parties but among the broader public as well, in order not to destabilize the process of building the technocratic government. But in terms of parties and political parties trusting to this process themselves, different parties have different cleavages about how they are positioning about this idea. But at the end of the day, according to my observation, all the key opposition political parties are basically on the same line, that if they want to to basically save themselves in the polarized political arena under GD-dominated political system where political parties are going to be executed. If they want to save themselves, they have to cooperate over certain axes. And at this moment, this axis of public trust, first of all, and leading the process anonymously somehow, not to fragment the process itself, is somehow to follow these principles of the charter and principles of the composition of new government. Of course, and as far as I know, President Zurabishvili in this case, as an initiator of this idea, is also on this line. Consolidation among the parties should be there. Losing the trust from the parties towards the technocratic government, whatever it is, should also be on the table. Otherwise, political parties will be lost as the key players, key weather makers of Georgian politics and reform systems and everything. So I think we have to absolutely realistically identify this potential that political parties, even though they used to be hostile throughout the previous years, they will manage to consolidate about this, at least temporarily. And then probably political processes will show us, because as a reminder, we have also self-government elections after a year, and those elections could be also really important weather maker on political arena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nino, for those very interesting and also cautiously optimistic, I guess, responses. We already ran out of time, but I want to hand the floor back to Natalie with a handful of questions. Maybe you can just pick and choose, because all of them are really interesting. So there is one question about the role of the Orthodox Church in the establishment of the illiberal, anti-liberal urbanization, Putinization model. And also the church made a statement yesterday about the elections and kind of shared its position. So maybe you could touch upon that. Then there is a question about the ruling party's narrative on territorial integrity, this promise of the restoration of territorial integrity in case of them winning the elections. How does it resonate? Is this trusted, believed by the voters? Then there is an interesting question on to what extent we should blame liberals. You've already mentioned that you believe that there is no need for this anti-LGBTQI propaganda law, but maybe you want to say more about this. And then there are two interesting questions about the regional context, namely how the Moldova referendum affects the elections in Georgia. And how the Georgian elections may affect the political situation and Armenia's EU integration. So a lot of questions. Maybe you can wrap it up within 5 minutes, and then we conclude, and you can just choose.
Yeah, thank you very
much. Natalie, sorry, you're muted.
Okay, excuse me. Interesting questions, and I'll try to very quickly go through them. The church is an important factor, of course. Church, what the Georgian Dream does, it appeals and it tries to present itself as a defender of the Georgian church. So I see a kind of mutual instrumentalization in this relationship, because I don't know how genuine it is. And first of all, I don't think the Georgian church needs defending from the political party, but because they want to appeal to side, and that fits into this whole traditional values discourse, which in many ways is also similar to Orban's kind of use of political Christianism. And making this a political point. So Georgian Dream also tried to do this. However, there have been some attempts to institutionalize this support, and the church declined. So there's also an interesting relationship in which I think the church understands that it is being instrumentalized for political purposes. And linked to this is this question of like, have we gone too liberal? Is it something that actually is unacceptable for genuinely majority of the people? And my answer to that is that this is not a real it is not a real threat. It's not a real issue in the case of Georgia. It is true that majority of Georgians are probably more conservative than and the average Georgian than, for instance, an average Dutch person. But this kind of plethora of political preferences exists everywhere, and there is a room within the system of liberal democracy to preserve your values that you consider are more important, more traditional. You don't have to go all the way to the extreme. And what is more important, nobody asks you to do that. Basically, the ask here is not to use traditional values as a cover for extreme authoritarianism, and this is the relationship. It's not there is no need to really do the protection because nobody asks. And the European Union, we know it's a mix of 27 countries that have very different traditions and are on a very different scales of acceptance of liberalism. But the importance here, the fundamental here, that defense of an individual, defense of a minority within the system, that democracy is not a majority dictatorship. I think these are the principles that are definitely worth defending, and I don't think there you can have a compromise or even a discussion. The question on territorial integrity has been floated as, and there's been a lot of speculation, and I think, now I'm speculating too, but I think the Georgian Dream hoped that there will be something more coming from Moscow that they could use and that would boost their electoral success. That maybe there were indications of this. They were, in fact, indications of this from Moscow, and I think then they backed off. So Georgian Dream was left with this apology about the start of the war. It was left with this kind of speculation in the air and being slapped in the face then once more by Russians. So before the elections, this is not going to be a major factor. If there had been a real sort of like a promise even of some kind of renegotiation of the status, that would have played out, I think, differently. And finally, I think this is a very good question about Armenia's trajectory, because if Georgia does not advance, and Armenia often mentions Georgia's progress as a kind of an example, if Georgia does not advance, it will be harder for Armenia in this region. However, I think Armenia is not necessarily pursuing the same type of Western foreign policy as Georgia had, which was very unequivocal. What Armenia is doing is shifting from its unequivocal dependence on Russia as a security provider and broadening its options. So Armenia is genuinely looking at multi-alignment and bringing EU as a stronger player, but not an exclusive player. For us, EU and European Euro-Atlantic integration was an exclusive choice. So these are slightly different. However, Georgia's success will reinforce, I think, Armenia's broadening of options. I'll stop here since we're late.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And yeah, maybe I just add one sentence on the Moldova referendum. I think it hasn't been widely discussed in Georgia, although the Georgian president during the rally on Sunday mentioned and wished success to Maya Sandu and the referendum. And it's certainly positive that the referendum was ultimately won, although the result could have been better. But I don't think this is a major issue in Georgia. At least it is not, because it was in the end won. Let's conclude this webinar here. big thanks to our panelists and to all our attendees. I think this was a really excellent discussions with lots of new perspectives and food for thought for the election day and for Georgia's political future. The stakes for those sharing democratic values and pro-European attitude in Georgia are really high. And all of us are excited and anxious about the upcoming elections. And very soon we will know the result. So thank you all for joining, and please keep your attention on Georgia, and let's see where we are next week. So thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.